teacher, hello students. Welcome to today's lesson on determination of levels of outputs, prices and employment, aggregate supply. In our last lesson, we discussed factors that determine aggregate demand. Let me remind you of the main points of our previous lesson. In the last lesson, we discussed that the determinants of aggregate demand, which are the factors other than the price level that cause the aggregate demand curve to shift either to the right or the left. An increase in aggregate demand is represented by a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve, while a decrease in aggregate demand is a leftward shift of the curve. We also noted that the determinants of aggregate demand work through the four aggregate expenditure categories. Students, in today's lesson, we will discuss aggregate supply, determinants of aggregate supply, and the determination of equilibrium output and prices by the interaction of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Students, what do you think is aggregate supply? Define aggregate supply based on your knowledge of aggregate demand. Raise up your hand and tell your classroom teacher what aggregate supply is. I hope you've attempted to define what aggregate supply is. To have a common understanding of the definition, let me give you the answer. Are you ready? Good. Aggregate supply, abbreviated as AS, is defined as the total output that producers in an economy are willing and able to produce and supply to the market over a given period of time at a given price level. Normally, there is a positive relationship between aggregate output, real GDP, supplied and the price level. The positive relationship between the general price level and the aggregate output supplied is represented by an upward sloping aggregate supply AS curve. As shown in the graph, other factors being constant, when the general price level increases, from P0 to P1, the level of real output increases from Q0 to Q1. Students, I hope you are now clear with the definition of aggregate supply and the relationship between aggregate output supplied and the general price. Now, I want you to do the second activity in groups. The question is, explain graphically the increase and decrease in aggregate supply. Students, did you explain the increase and decrease in aggregate supply using graphical illustration? I hope you've done so as you did for the aggregate demand. Let's now see it together. Check yours. A change in aggregate supply is graphically illustrated by a shift in the aggregate supply curve either to the left or to the right due to the change in one or more of the determinants of aggregate demand. As illustrated in the graph, an increase in aggregate supply is explained by a rightward shift of the curve, that is, a shift from AS0 to AS1. Conversely, a decrease in aggregate supply is explained by a leftward shift of the curve, that is, a shift from AS0 to AS2. Students, from the discussion we had, we've seen that the determinants of aggregate supply are those factors that determine the location of the aggregate supply curve. The common determinants of aggregate supply are in one way or another related to the change in resource prices, productivity, legal and institutional environment, and weather conditions. Let's now examine the effects of changes in resource prices and change in productivity on aggregate supply. Changes in resource prices are related to the availability and price of domestic resources as well as imported resources. A number of factors influence input prices. For instance, increases in the availability of domestic resources such as land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial ability lead to lower input prices and decrease per unit production costs. As a result, at any specific price level, firms will produce and supply more real output than before. This implies an increase in aggregate supply, which is explained by a rightward shift of the curve. The reverse is also true. Change in productivity relates a nation's level of real output to the quantity of input used to produce that output. Students, do you know the sources of productivity? Well, improvements in production technology and managerial efficiency are among the important sources of increase in productivity. Thus, an increase in productivity due to improved technology and or managerial efficiency shifts the aggregate supply curve rightward by reducing per unit production costs. On the other hand, a decline in productivity increases per unit production costs and shifts the aggregate supply curve leftward. Students, what is the effect of education and training on the aggregate supply of an economy? Discuss with the student sitting next to you. Students, did you have the discussion? If you said that education and training have positive effect on the aggregate supply, you are right. Let me explain why this is so. Education and training increase the quality of human capital, which in turn increases the productivity of the labor force. This means an individual can produce more output than before, which translates to a lower per unit cost of production. As a result, the aggregate supply increases. Students, let's also discuss the effect of legal and institutional environment, which are commonly related to business taxes and subsidies, as well as government regulation. Changes in the legal institutional setting in which businesses operate may affect per unit costs of output and shift the aggregate supply curve. Two changes of this type are changes in taxes and subsidies and government regulations. Higher business taxes increase per unit costs. Other things being equal, increase in per unit costs reduces per unit profit of businesses. This discourages them and results in reduction in aggregate supply. On the other hand, a business subsidy reduces production costs and encourages businesses and thus increases aggregate supply. Government regulations can equally affect per unit production costs of businesses. Unfavorable regulations tend to increase per unit costs and reduce aggregate supply. I hope you can explain how changes in climate or weather conditions can affect the aggregate supply, as Ethiopia's economy is highly dependent on climatic conditions. The question is, what is the impact of change in climate or weather condition on the aggregate supply? Discuss in groups. Students, I hope you enjoyed your group discussion. Let's now do it together. Favorable climatic or weather conditions lead to higher agricultural production and thus increase aggregate supply. Conversely, unfavorable climatic or weather conditions such as drought can seriously reduce agricultural output, which in turn leads to a decrease in aggregate supply, explained by a leftward shift of the aggregate supply curve. Well, students, the last point that we will see in today's lesson is the determination of the equilibrium level of national output and the general price level by the interaction of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves. As is evident from the diagram, the equilibrium price level and real output correspond to PE and QE respectively, where aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves intersect at point E. If the price level is above PE, quantity of real output demanded is less than the quantity supplied. Hence, there will be unsold output and the price level will decline, causing a decrease in the general price level. At some point, when the price level declines enough, aggregate demand just equals aggregate supply and equilibrium is attained at point E. Similar reasoning is applied if the price level happens to be below equilibrium, except now aggregate demand would exceed aggregate supply, a shortage of goods and services would prevail, and the price level would be forced upward as occurs when there is shortage in any given market. Students, let me now summarize the main points of the lesson. Watch carefully. In today's lesson, we discussed the aggregate supply and its determinants, as well as the determination of equilibrium price levels and real output. We noted that the positive relation between aggregate supply and price level is represented by an upward sloping curve. We examined the determinants of aggregate supply in terms of the change in resource prices and availability, productivity, legal and institutional environment, and weather condition. We also discussed that equilibrium price levels and real output are determined by the interaction of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves. Well, students, with this we end today's lesson on aggregate supply and determination of levels of outputs, prices and employment. In the next non-plasma lesson, you will learn about macroeconomic policies. Next time, I will come with another program. Until then, goodbye teacher, goodbye students.